I do research in down in, well, I used to once upon a time, down in Guerrero Negro, which is about halfway down the Baja Peninsula. And you can see the pink color here is caused by halophilic microorganisms, and we'll touch on those in a couple lectures. But inside this gypsum crust, there's a cyanobacterial community. This is actually an Antarctic crust. So there's dry, I know we normally think of Antarctica as being covered with ice, but there's dry air portion of, of Antarctica as well. In fact, it's called the Dry Valleys region. And these are what we would refer to as cold deserts. And so these cryptoendoliths were found when people started researching these cold desert habitats. And they discovered like a whole new zoo of life once they started cutting open these rocks. All right, so those are kind of boutique terrestrial environments. Most of what we're going to talk about today are soils and sediments. And when we talk about soil, this is like a whole field of study, right? So you can go, especially if you go to like an agricultural college, like if you were at UC Davis, and you could even major in soil science or what's called pedology. And so there's a lot of research that goes into that. And of course, it's really of intense interest to farming and other, water management and all of these important aspects that soil plays a big role with. Today, I'm just going to give you kind of a very light version of some of the terminology as well as the way the microbes are found and how they interact in this soil environment. So what you have to remember about soils, and I know things are weird here because it doesn't rain very often, but put yourself in the mind frame of like you're in, I don't know, Iowa, right? Cornfields, rich agricultural land, and it rains quite a bit, especially in the spring, and it snows in the winter, like right now. In fact, I think they got a big snow dump yesterday. So the surface of the soil may be dry, but the water table actually is going to be not too far down. And so this zone where water will percolate down through into that zone is referred to as the vadose zone. And then where the two come together is referred to as the capillary fringe. And it's kind of like water wicks its way up into this. But for the most part, if this is well drained, well aerated soil, it won't be super wet unless it rained very recently. So before we get too far into the soil though, I just want to have a poll question. And actually I didn't set this up yet. So let's see. All right, I think we can do that. All right. So what I want to do to answer is, which of the following habitats has the most diverse communities of microbes, do you think? Soils and sediments that we're talking about today, freshwater or seawater, we're going to talk about those next time, the atmosphere that we just talked about, or deep subsurface. Where do you think we find the most diverse communities of microbes? So go ahead and answer. You're not being graded on whether you get it right. This is kind of a pre-quiz before we launch into these habitats. All right, that's most of you. Go ahead and log in your answer. Is that everybody? All right. Okay. So I guess I should move this up in the lecture because I think most of you put A probably because we're just about to start the soil or sediments, but somebody that put soil or sediments, why did you put A as your answer? Anybody want to explain their thinking there?
I just figured that there's more diversity when there's when you're looking at soils because not every environment is consistent. So there's a lot of like environmental pressures. So I just figured there'd be more diversity.
Okay. All right. So quite a few people put seawater. Why did you put seawater if that was the answer that you put? Anybody want to share?
I just feel that seawater covers more surface area than land on Earth, so there might be more communities and diversification in seawater.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Any other thoughts that anybody wants to share about your thinking on this question? Okay. So it turns out that in terms of diversity, A is probably the correct answer. It turns out that soils um, and sediments are often very diverse in their communities. And that's actually the topic that I'd like you to think about in a quick breakout session. So what I want you to discuss in your breakout is, given that I just told you that soils and sediments are often quite diverse in terms of microbes, this is a picture of a typical soil particle. Okay, so take a look at that and then think about how the particulate nature, this is a soil particle, right? So particulate nature of soil would contribute to higher diversity in this habitat. So I want you guys to think about, see if I can get this to work. Come on. Oops. All right, let's get breakouts. Okay, so let's do 5 breakout rooms. All right, I'll go ahead and open those. So just take a few minutes to talk about how this particle-like nature might contribute to diversity, and then we'll come back and discuss. All right. So does somebody want to share what you guys talked about in your group about how this might be related to the diversity?
We spoke about the maybe there can be more nutrients, more more water since it can like around the soil, more resources for it. That's what's more diverse in the soil.
Okay, so you can see this water packet inside the particle. Okay, and maybe nutrients would be kind of the organic material here.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? What did some of the other groups discuss? How does that lead to kind of, how would that translate to diversity? And what I mean by diversity, well, I guess maybe let's stop and define that first. Maybe we should have done that before the breakout. What do you think I meant by diversity of microorganisms? When I say that, what do you think?
Different bacteria species.
Okay, so yeah, so let's say different species. Okay. So if there's lots of different species, then what are the things that can drive this? Sanjana in the chat notes it has an excess of nutrients, okay, or access to that, okay. So maybe the presence of nutrients and water is good, but you know the ocean has water and the ocean has nutrients. So what's special about particles? What do you think? Anybody, any of the other groups have any thoughts on that?
Would it be like different metabolic needs according to their like microenvironment?
Yeah, I like that term microenvironment. So there are very diverse environments within this particle, right? So we could think, okay, so maybe some organisms like to live here, like shown here on this quartz, right? Quartz is hard rock. Okay, so maybe some live there, but then we can also see some here. And what do you notice about this microcolony? What's going on there?
They're also interacting with the air.
Yeah, so over here, it might be anaerobic. Here, we might have little air pockets, or here it might be solid organic material. And you can see some of them are here, but then they also are found here. They might be forming a biofilm or some sort of community. But I think the thing I want you to take from this is that for as many different micro habitats, or what we might call micro niches, right, you're likely to get different types of microorganisms that live there, right, and interact with each other. And so the highly particulate nature of soils and sediments leads to even higher total diversity. Okay. It's not that there isn't structure or particles in the oceans, and we will, or in the freshwater, we will talk about that. But it's the very essence, essentially, of soils and sediments that they're made up of these particles that have all of these interesting little niches inside them that likely leads to their high diversity. Any questions about that? Did any of the other groups talk about any other possibilities?
Group 2, we talked about how soil doesn't flow. So because there's not a lot of movement, the particulates that are available, the nutrients that are available are better accessed by microbes that have the ability to move towards them, maybe.
Okay. So the sort of almost static element as opposed to like ocean water moving around with the tides or whatever might lead to that. And that's actually where the flow of water through, like I was talking about, from the vadose zone down into the water table can play a really important role, because water does move through, it just doesn't move through all the time. But having the sort of static structured environment there, then punctuated with occasional rain events or whatever, could lead to enhanced diversity as well. Yeah, that's something I hadn't really thought about, but it's an interesting idea.
Dr. Dillon,
Yeah,
I have a question.
sure.
Since they brought up the whole thing about being static, wouldn't that create a limitation of nutrients as well? Since nothing is
It
really
could.
moving.
It could, yeah. So if you don't have, and motility admittedly is a little bit challenging, right? It's a lot easier to swim around in a liquid medium than it is in a solid porous medium. But remember, these microbes are so small that you can actually end up with motile organisms that go, through this air pocket or the water pocket or whatever, because of their very small scale. But you can end up with local limitations, like you're alluding to, Daniel. So that's a good point. So, all right. Anything else that anybody talked about? Awesome. All right. Well, that's good. So let me just ask you, I've now done this 4 or 5 times this semester. Do you guys feel like having the opportunity to take a break from the lecture and go into the discussion breakouts is helpful in terms of, kind of just breaking things up, but also enabling you to chat amongst yourselves?
Yeah, I feel like it's really good because we get to discuss and actually like engage with the material, I feel like.
Okay. Great. Well, this is one of the ways that I'm trying to kind of get you guys to be able to, first of all, not just listen to me the entire time, but also to, do things a little differently because of the Zoom environment that we're in. So I'm glad to hear that. So I will keep doing it then. Sounds good. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, and as we've now kind of discussed a little bit more detail, soil is a porous medium in the sense that water flows through. And in fact, it's about a half and half, solids to spaces, essentially. So you've got minerals, which are, sort of the rocks that are being broken down. Soils ultimately originate from both the hard rocks in, the Earth's crust, as well as organic material, plant material, things like that that are breaking down. And so quite a lot of it, of the solid material, is in this mineral form. But that only makes up about half of what we think of as a soil. And so the other half is pore space. And in that pore space, like we saw in the particle a moment ago, you can have both liquids as well as air. And certainly the movement of liquids through it is going to be important. And gravity is going to play a big role, right? So as we saw with the vadose zone, you typically have water coming in on the top, rain, and then it percolates its way down into the soil through gravitational force. This is going to be key to the movement of microbes as well as the movement of nutrients that get carried along as the water flows through. As Daniel alluded to, you can get sort of limitations because of the static nature, and so diffusion or nutrient limitations can become really prevalent as well. But there will be gases that are present, and they're not always oxygen, right? So if you have strong respiratory activity, what kind of gas is going to build up in those soils? What's the product of respiration?
CO2.
CO2.
Exactly. So in certain circumstances, you may end up with high CO2 levels inside soils. And so you can end up with 20-fold increases in some cases. Flooding, of course, if you get lots of rain, right? Large scale flooding, or let's say a river diverts into a field and saturates it, then this can actually reduce the amount of gaseous pore space and up the amount of water pore space. So that's kind of a balance. Then as it dries out, you get more gases coming back in. So it's a very complex microhabitat, lots of different niches, as we mentioned, and there's different kinds of soils. And so we're going to talk today about some of the different classifications of soils. I'm not going to test you on all of the nitty-gritty details of all of this, but what I want you to have an appreciation for is the fact that there are many different kinds of soils, and of course that's going to have a huge impact on the microbes that are found there. Some are going to be very organic rich, whereas others will be more rocky or mineral rich. And a lot of that has to do with where the soil is found and what the parent material comes from. And by parent, I mean, what's the source of it? So if it's mainly derived from the weathering or the breakdown of hard rocks, like in the mountains, right? Then that may be more mineral rich. Whereas if there's a lot of vegetation in a certain area, like a jungle, for example, then you'd end up with often very organic, rich soils. The other thing to think about is that we've got the particles that we mentioned, but we also have patchiness. And by patchiness, I mean it might differ on very short spatial scales, but some places might be very diverse and very nutrient rich. Others might be right nearby. There might be a different patch that has lower nutrients or lower water. And so you can end up with, and if the microbes are bound to the soils, then they're going to be kind of at the whims of whatever these different patches contain. So that's what I mean by this physical structuring that we alluded to earlier. Now, soil scientists will classify soils and they have structure. So they have what are referred to as horizons. So, and what you can see here is at the very surface, it's often referred to as the O horizon. And I'll bet you can guess what the O comes from, given what I've got a picture of on the top of this. What do you think O stands for?
Oxygenated?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it probably is oxygenated, but that's not what I don't think that's why they labeled it O. What other O word? Say again?
Organic soil.
Organic, yes. So that horizon is where you have the vegetation, and so you have a lot of the breakdown of organic material. Below that, as you can see here on the left, is a layer where things are going to be moving from, and then a layer where things are moving to. So the alluviation layer is what's moving from, and the illuviation layer is where it ends up. Think of it like the term emigration and immigration, right? If you emigrate, you leave a place and you immigrate into a place. So in this case, what we're talking about are nutrients and water. And the water moves down through the soil. So it's going to be carrying nutrients down into these different layers. And so we have, and you don't need to know all the details of what the A, B, C, and R horizons are, but just suffice it to understand that this is kind of a transitory or changing zone as things move through here from the O horizon and end up getting deposited farther down here in the B horizon. The other term I want you to be familiar with up here is rhizosphere. Okay, so somebody give us a brief definition of what you think of when I say the word rhizosphere. What do you think that term means? You can probably figure it out from the picture. Roots. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. So the rhizosphere is the zone of soils that involves the roots of vegetation. And roots play a really important role in creating additional habitats for microorganisms. Many microbes are associated with roots. And it's not just the nodulating nitrogen fixtures, which we will talk about later this semester, but the vast majority of microbes found in the rhizosphere will be either directly or indirectly impacted by the presence of plants there. And of course, remember, the plants are going to be importing and exporting both water and nutrients. And so they have a really profound impact. The microbes that live there interact with the plants very directly and indirectly as well. All right, another set of terms that you need to know are humic or humic acids and lignin. So these are refractory or hard to break down organic compounds. So humic acids are monomers of organic material that polymerize and form these very complicated high molecular weight molecules in soils. And so if you have a soil rich in humics, it's actually very rich organic soil, so it's very highly sought after. Lignin is a recalcitrant or hard to break down portion of plant carbon. So cellulose, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a big part of plants, and it's arguably the most abundant polymer on the planet. Cellulose is pretty easy to break down because what is cellulose composed of? Does anybody remember? Cellulose is a polymer of what kind of molecules?
Glucose.
Yes. So we've got the cellulose is actually fairly easy to break down using enzymes that many soil microbes have called cellulase enzymes. And in fact, Dr. Berlamont in our department studies or has studied in the past the diversity of cellulase enzymes in soils. Lignin, on the other hand, is a more difficult to break down portion of the decaying plant material. And so it's often present even long after the cellulose is degraded. Now soils can, so we've talked about horizons, but we can also talk about like classifying types of soils. And this is often going to be very tied to chemistry and weather. And really what we're talking about here is the composition of the soil and what kind of materials are found in it. So hopefully you've all like dug in the dirt at some point. And maybe you've dug up like a really, often here we have very clay rich soil. So you pick it up and it's compacted, right? So clay soils are often very high in water or water content, and that's what I mean by WC. But they're also very high in terms of IEC, which is the ion exchange capacity. So clay particles are charged. So they have lots of things like potassium and sodium, which as you know are ions, right? So these clay particles are often very charged. And that means they interact with other chemicals and water in interesting ways. Sandy soils, by contrast, are very low in water content and low in those charged particles. So what do you think that means in terms of water content in a clay soil up here versus a sandy soil down here? If you had to guess where there'd be more water if I just went out on a random day and dug into it, are you going to find more water in clays or in sand?
Clay.
And in clay. And that's because of the very fine particles that clay has. So sand particles are actually larger and they allow the water to go through. So do we have any gardeners in the group? if you garden and your soil is too clay rich, you often will add some sand to it, and that will help drainage, because you don't want soil that doesn't drain water at all. Silt is actually ground that is laid down like by rivers and in lakes, and it's intermediate. So it's higher water content than sand, but lower than clay. And it's also low in the ion exchange. So not as many charged particles there. So this is like the 3 tips of this pyramid, but you can see there's lots of intermediate classifications, and loam is one of these intermediate sand, soil components that can play an important role, particularly good for agriculture. So you don't have to memorize this pyramid, but you do need to know that clay is high in water content and ion exchange, sand is low in both, and silt is kind of intermediate in the water and low in the IEC. And more importantly, you need to understand that the different soil types will greatly impact the microbes that live there. Okay. Another factor that really impacts microbes is pH. And of course, chemistry, as we've just alluded to, plays a big role in soils, and the pH of the soil matters. Okay. And the pH of that soil will affect the solubility of chemicals in it. And this is going to be really drastically affected by rainfall. So it turns out that you'd think that for soils, lots of rain would be good. And it often is. And of course, if you think about like a rainforest, they get a lot of rain there. It's interesting though, because in those rainforests, you often have very acidic soils, because what happens is the large amount of water rushing through the soil constantly leaches out basic cations and leaves behind some of those organic acids, like those humic acids that I was alluding to earlier. And so the pH in very rainy rainforest soils is often low, like on the order of 5.5, which is quite acidic. Remember, pH is a log scale. So now, if you do have lots of moisture, though, you may have high organic material. And so you may end up with a lot of those humic acids and those decay products that are formed there. Conversely, if you have lots of rainfall, you're going to have less leaching, less organic material, and so you typically will have more neutral or alkaline soils. So the amount of rainfall you get has a big impact on soil pH, and then that in turn, of course, will help drive the kinds of plants that can live there, as well as the microorganisms that live there. Okay. All right, so what does this all mean? I mentioned we've got a lot of diversity there, right? So it's the most diverse environment. There's lots of abundance. Who's there? Well, it's mostly going to be bacteria. Upwards of 10 to the 10 cells per gram. We measure it in grams because it's a solid medium. And so you may end up with upwards of 10 to the 10th. We're not going to be able to culture all of them, though. And so usually you might have 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th culturable bacteria per gram. They often will produce exopolysaccharides, which are extracellular kind of mucousy byproducts that are released by the microbes. EPS is really involved in biofilm formation, right? Now in a soil, that biofilm may look very different than it would in like a river. In this case, what happens is it contributes to the aggregation of the particles in the soil. So it can end up trapping and binding parts together. And so this contributes to the particulate nature of soils and sediments. I should note that I'm using the term soil and sediments fairly interchangeably. Sediments are really used to describe the ground underneath aquatic habitats, like in a lake bottom or in the bottom of the ocean. Whereas soils are what we would describe as sort of the exposed to the air kind of terrestrial habitats. There are some differences there, but for this class, we're pretty much lumping them all in together. So most of these microbes are going to be sorbed or stuck to those particles. And again, it highlights the really important nature, the particulate nature of soil. Among bacteria, most of them will be gram negative, things like pseudomonads or agrobacteria or predatory myxobacteria. We'll talk about them later this semester. So I want to highlight that the majority of microbes in any environment are gram negative. Okay, remember we talked about the gram stain being one way we can taxonomically classify our bacteria. However, soils have they're still a minority, but it's a larger fraction in soils than in other habitats like aquatic of gram positives. There are a lot of gram-positive spore formers like bacillus, right, which is sort of the classical spore former, or actinomycetes. And actinomycetes play a huge role. So actinomycetes are called actinomycetes because they were originally thought to be fungi. They're these long branched filamentous bacteria, but they're really gram-positive bacteria. And they can give some very important features of soils. One is if you've ever like picked up dirt, especially after it's rained and you smell that kind of earthy smell, what you're actually smelling is this substance geosmin, which is produced by these actinomycetes. The other thing that actinomycetes do in the soil is produce antibiotics. The vast majority of commercially used or medically used antibiotics are derived from actinomycetes originally. And the reason that these actinomycetes produce so many is that they're in incredible competition with other microbes, other bacteria living in these soils. And so over the millions and millions of years, they've produced lots of different antibiotics. And we've exploited that to isolate their antibiotics. It's not just bacteria that live there though. So we have archaea, particularly the Crenarchaeota and the Taumarchaeota, are found quite abundantly in grasslands and forests. We didn't really realize that until maybe 20 years ago when we started doing molecular analyses. All right, I've run over time as usual, so I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions on anything we talked about in today's lecture?
Yeah, I have a question. Just right now, when you were talking about the exopolysaccharides, and you said that they aggregate, like aggregation, like it helps clump together, right?
Right.
Okay.
So that contributes to the particulate nature.
Right.
And having these little micro habitats and micro niches.
Okay, thank you.
So the microbes contribute to this. It's not just the rocks and the air and whatever. They produce the EPS, and then that can further cause the particles to form.
Great, understood. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So we live in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles, you were saying, has the soil is mostly kind of clay.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of got me thinking about unusual rainfall in Los Angeles and how that might affect the microbes in the soil.
Yeah, so, it's a very dry here most of the time, right? But of course, then we get these bursts of rain like we've had the last week or two. And so the microbes that live here kind of have to be adapted to that. They're pretty transient. So I would say that the majority of microbes would need to be adapted to very arid conditions most of the time. Of course, that varies, right? I mean, if you're going out like in a well-watered lawn, then the soil there would be completely artificial, right? And very different.
Mhm.
But let's say we're going to a drier location that's not asphalt paved, that's like sort of natural dirt as much as we can get in the LA County. You'd have to be very desiccation and drought tolerant, just like a lot of our plants have to be adapted to that. And then, you know, when we get these bursts of water, though, you're absolutely right. It could have a profound impact. And so many of those organisms may reproduce when the water comes. They may lie dormant for months at a time. And then when we get this nice moisture like we're getting recently, they spring into action. They come out of their spores or their resting structures, and they may germinate into vegetative cells, which then reproduce a few times, and then they may slow down again when it dries out. Because moisture, of course, plays a huge role in the activity of microbes. And so that's definitely something that probably contributes to their kind of their life cycle. This is going to be even more profoundly felt out in the deserts where, you know, rarely rains. But obviously microbes here in this kind of, you know, coastal Mediterranean climate like we have here in California are going to be very different than the soils that are found in like the Midwestern US or the deep South where it rains a lot more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So be thinking about reading those papers, and I will see you, or that paper, and I will see you guys on Wednesday.